Parts of the Chris Hani Memorial Site in Boksburg have been vandalized, and this comes just over a week after the SACP's leader, or killer rather, Janusz Walus was granted parole. This is not the first incident in which monuments, of course, in this country have been destroyed. But let's make sense of this moment for you now. Bring in Angelo Fick, who's the director of research at the Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute, joining us via our video link this morning. Angelo, always great to have you on the program. Thanks so much indeed for making time to chat to us. There's still no way of saying without any doubt that these two incidents are related, Janusz Walus's parole and the damaging of Chris Hani's memorial site. But one can't help but juxtapose these two incidents and reflect perhaps on what's become of Chris Hani's legacy.
Absolutely, and bearing in mind your caveat, correlation is not causation, and that this may just be coincidence.
Right.
I think the reaction to the event reveals a lot about South Africa at the moment, not least our obsessions with unfinished business from the past, but also with, I think, the way in which people understand questions of justice, questions of administration, questions of bureaucracy, this deep into the democratic state. And that, I think, speaks to some weaknesses in the way in which we've built the society and how people behave in it.
Yeah. Speaking about some of those weaknesses, I mean, the ANC has led the charge in some respects of those who are outraged over the Constitutional Court's ruling releasing Janusz Walus on parole. But one can also, I guess, ask questions around what the governing party has done to address some of that unfinished business you speak of, so that at the very least there could be different reflections around how far we've come when this man is being released.
Yes, and also I think it doesn't surprise me that a political party that has governed this country for 28 years, but only put a memorial up to one of its most significant figures in 2015, and has been implicated, some of its cadres having been implicated in the mismanagement of other people's memorials. One thinks of Winnie Mandela's Brandfort House, for example. This does not surprise me, and how this is being played with as a political football, given the party's internal crisis, also doesn't surprise me. What I think we need to be very careful of in South Africa is to assume that political parties of any stripe or kind necessarily reflect what ordinary people's views are, given the voting patterns, given how many people vote, and given often the gap between what political parties profess and what it is that ordinary South Africans ask for, profess and desire. And so the ANC's outrage may be very legitimate that one of their own cadres and one of their alliance partners members, heroes, has been, sort of desecrated. The memory has been desecrated in this way. But the ANC must also admit that this constitutional fabric that we live with, this society, is one that it helped build, and that it must stand by that Constitutional Court ruling precisely because the administration of justice is necessarily bureaucratic, and the reasons for not giving Mr. Walus any kind of parole would, have to be dealt with by some other authority in terms of the things that have not been unearthed about the death of Chris Hani. Yeah. And his is not the only death that remains unsolved. There are many, many others that remain unresolved, and the post-apartheid state has done not enough to give answers to those families about what happened to the people who died.
Yeah. This moment, of course, also helps us reflect once again on the power of symbols and symbolism in the form of these monuments. I mean, that kind of conversation was really thrust into the spotlight back during the fees and more specifically the roles must fall era in institutions of higher learning, where there was so much robust discussion around how we see some of these signs and how our response to it is an indication of, I guess, where we are in reflecting on what these signs actually mean. Chris Hani, I think you'd have to look far and wide in our society to find people who don't revere him as a hero. And so I guess in that context, how do we reflect on these efforts to desecrate his monument in this way?
So one must admit that firstly, historically, monuments have always been propaganda. They've always been set up by state authorities to venerate their version of the past. And so we must be aware that any monument is necessarily going to speak to the moment in which it is constructed and the moment in which it is made. And so monuments always work by propaganda. They're not history. The historians will look at monuments, but monuments do not tell a history. They tell a particular version of history, and they tell a particular victor's version of history. Whether you're talking about the Arc de Triomphe, whether you're talking about the Statue of Liberty, whether you're talking about any of the memorials around London, the Cenotaph, or or whether you're talking about the statue of Samora Machel in Maputo. You're always going to be looking at a particular version. And so here, the destruction of monuments may just be ordinary criminality, but it may also be people's unhappiness, and it's not clear who that would be, because so many people are unhappy with the post-apartheid order, and not all of them necessarily longing back for a 1994 order, but many of them who were supposedly beneficiaries of the 1994 settlement, very unhappy with how they haven't benefited from this. And so the deep divisions in our society that were unearthed by the Fees Must Fall and Rose Must Fall campaigns, showing that monuments do not necessarily suture over pain, not just of the past but in the present, must be dealt with by authorities at every level. And this includes the society as a whole having to pay attention to this. Yes, monuments may be important for us to get a sense of who we think we are, but we must always remember that they also reflect something about our skewed sense of ourselves. And so, yes, it's important to figure Mr. Hani as a significant hero of the anti-apartheid struggle. But that often domesticates the very, very scathing critiques that Mr. Hani would make of contemporary South Africa, precisely because it falls short of any of the aspirations that he encouraged his followers and those members of his movement to engage in.
It's an interesting take. Speaking about critique, the Constitutional Court, of course, being on the receiving end of a lot of criticism around their reasoning in granting Janusz Walus this parole. And, there have been concerns raised around how we should actually respond to that ruling if not for anything but the integrity of the court itself and the judiciary. A lot of comments have been made. Many of them can be seen, I guess, as political statements or, have been, this moment being used as some kind of political football, as it were. But how important is it for us to, whilst there may very well be disgruntlement around Janusz Walus being released, how important is it for us to be careful how we respond to this ruling, lest it cost the judiciary its integrity?
So for me, it's not about the sanctity of the judiciary. It is about distinguishing between my emotional response to an event and my understanding of the legal process by which that event would have happened. And here I think too many people respond to court judgments of all sorts based on their emotional investment in the court judgment or process, rather than on the spirit and letter of the law. And here an understanding of the legal system is something that I think many, many South Africans may need to be inculcated into. So we know from various benchmark tests that for a very long time, over a decade period, 78% of 10-year-olds couldn't read for meaning. We know that we lagged in terms of the education system long before that into the mid to late 90s because of the legacy of Bantu education and the legacy of Christian nationalist education. And so how ordinary South Africans engage with the courts and the understanding of judgments, I think, may be something that over the next decade we have to look at, precisely because so many more judgments are going to come in around energy policy, around climate catastrophe mitigation, around water resource management, that ordinary South Africans have to engage in. Here I think it's important that the Department of Basic Education begins to play its role alongside other departments in government administration to make sure that ordinary South Africans understand how the law works, what the role of the courts are, the role of the court is, and how it is that we can respond to judgments critically without necessarily undermining individual judges or necessarily the rule of law. Yeah. And that's a very difficult thing to do, because I may disagree with the judgment but understand its logic very, very fully in terms of how the law works. And that's something that very many South Africans are going to have to come to terms with, because over the next few years there are likely to be legal challenges to election outcomes, to a variety of policy initiatives that we will have to engage.
Incredibly complex stuff. Thanks for helping us think through it. Angelo Fick, always a pleasure having you on the program. Thanks very much indeed for your time. Angelo Fick, of course, is the Director of Research at the Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute. Once again, thanks very much indeed.